Good evening. I'm Cindy Jordan, a member of the Board of Directors of the Walnut Creek Library Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you this evening to our virtual Live from the Library program, The Bounty. I'd like to thank our sponsors who have helped make this event possible. Our presenting sponsor is the Simpson family. Our masterpiece sponsors are Marianne Haruska, Robin Kokomore Rangel and Arthur Rangel, Rudney Associates, and Whittier Trust. Our classic sponsors are Sharon and James Moore, Mount Diablo Resource Recovery, and Rattan and Tucker LLP. Our bestseller sponsors are Stanley Buller, the Howard and Susan Geifman Philanthropic Fund, Cynthia and Ward Pinn, Cindy and Thomas Silva, and Diane Crowley Young and Lance Young. Our contributing sponsor is Bill King. Our media and print sponsors are Diablo Magazine, East Bay Times, and Minuteman Press Lafayette. Thank you all. I'm pleased to welcome tonight's presenter back to our live programs, an adventurer and lecturer with an interest in exploration, Mark Jordan. Mark is a retired attorney who now teaches and lectures on the Lewis and Clark expedition, William Shakespeare, and the Shackleton expedition at various venues, including the Walnut Creek Library, the Black Hawk Museum, and OLLI programs in the Bay Area and beyond. Tonight, Mark will present the fascinating story of one of the most controversial events in maritime history. He will discuss the men, the mission, and the mutiny on the HMAV Bounty. We will learn how the story ends, how the notorious Captain Bligh made his miraculous 4,000-mile journey in a 23-foot boat, the disappearance of Fletcher Christian and his mutineers, and the eventual discovery of their whereabouts 20 years later. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A. Please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, to submit your questions at any time. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider making a donation to the Library Foundation to support our programs. Visit our website at www.wclibrary.org or click on the link located in the chat box to donate. Without further ado, please welcome Mark Jordan.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome aboard His Majesty's Armed Vessel Bounty. Tonight, I'm going to take you on the miraculous voyage of the Mutiny on the Bounty, history and myth, or fact, fiction, and fantasy. So let me get set up here, and we can start. In 1768, James Cook was sent by the British Admiralty to Tahiti to observe and record the transit of Venus, a process used to measure astronomical distances. Aboard the ship was a young naturalist by the name of Joseph Banks. Joseph Banks returned to England having been tattooed, having enjoyed Tahitian women, and having cemented his reputation as one of the world's leading botanists. In 1776, Captain Cook made his third voyage. With him as master, that is navigator, was a young man by the name of William Bligh. Bligh had proved to be a fine sailor with great navigational skills. In the mid-1780s, Banks was approached by planters from the West Indies who wanted to feed their slaves as cheaply as possible, and Banks knew of the perfect plant, the breadfruit native to Tahiti. Banks chose his ship, originally named the Bethia, which he renamed His Majesty's Armed Vessel Bounty. And there you see the reproduction used in the Marlon Brando movie. And he chose as his captain William Bligh. In late 1787, the Bounty was ready to embark on one of the most notorious voyages in the history of the great sailing ships. So let's look at some of our cast of characters. There is William Bligh. He became involved in two other mutinies, one when he was governor of New South Wales, Australia. Was he as horrendous as Charles Lawton portrayed him? Then there's Fletcher Christian, apparently as handsome as Gable and extremely athletic. He had sailed with Bligh well before the Bounty's sailing. Bligh had admired and liked Christian and had, quote, taken him under his wing, unquote. So what might have prompted the mutiny? Peter Hayward, a mutineer, also given special treatment by Bligh, at least according to Bligh. Hayward is the model for Roger Byam in the Nordhoff and Hall novel A Mutiny on the Bounty, and of Byam, the Franchot Tone character in the Lawton film. Will you be surprised to know that Hayward's role did not happen as depicted in the movie? James Morrison, mutineer. Morrison wrote his own version of the Bounty story, citing events not recorded by Bligh's log. And Alexander Smith, able seaman and mutineer. What is his story or stories? So, what do we think of the movies? The 1935 version of the Mutiny on the Bounty with Charles Lawton, Clark Gable, and Franchot Tone, at least to me, defines the common understanding of the mutiny. The unequivocally brutal Bligh, a much put upon Fletcher Christian, attempting to make things right for himself and every sailor. Franchot Tone playing the fictional Roger Byam, the falsely accused seaman who sought to prevent the mutiny, and the mutiny, of course, a result of the utter uncontrollable tyranny of Bligh. Each actor was nominated for an Academy Award, though none won. The movie did win the Best Picture. It's a wonderful picture. How close to factual is it? Well, the movie opens with two depictions that are frightfully wrong. An opening shot declares this mutiny, famous in history and legend, helped bring about a new discipline based upon mutual respect between officers and men, by which British sea power is maintained as security for all who pass upon the sea. A wonderful sentiment in 1936, given what was going on at the time, but this mutiny certainly did not change things. Naval flogging did not end until well into the 19th century. The first scene in the movie shows Fletcher Christian entering a pub and pressing men into service. No sailor aboard the Bounty had been forced onto the ship by a press gang. They were all volunteers. The 40-year-old Joseph Banks appears as a much older man. Several sailors were given false names. Such were the liberties taken in the name of drama. There were many, many more. Then in 1962, we get Marlon Brando portraying Christian as a rather supercilious fop, and Trevor Howard was a more controlled tyrant than Lawton. Close to factual? Then in 1984, we get The Bounty, in which Anthony Hopkins plays a sensitive and overwrought Bligh to the mad Mel Gibson's frenetic Christian. Interesting, the movie offer some key facts of the Bounty's excursion. But is this revisionist vision of two of the most famous sailors in history correct? One thing is certainly accurate. When the sailors reached Tahiti, they enjoyed a paradise unthought of in England, and oh, to have experienced that paradise. So our narrative is broken down into, there's the Mel Gibson movie, into several chapters. Chapter 1, the sailing of the ship to Tahiti. Chapter 2, the mutiny. Chapter 3, the incredible voyage of Bligh and his loyal followers in the Bounty launch. Chapter 4, the perambulations of the Bounty after the mutiny. Chapter 5, the capture of the mutineers who remained in Tahiti and their return to England. Chapter 6, the court-martial of those mutineers and their ultimate fates. Chapter 7, what happened to the Bounty and Fletcher Christian after its final departure from Tahiti? And Chapter 8, can we solve the mysteries of the mutiny? So let's get going with Chapter 1. The Bounty was scheduled to leave England late November 1787, but many delays held it in port until December 23rd. And here you see where they started from. Bligh was frantic because delay meant that the Bounty would encounter worsening weather in its attempt to sail around Cape Horn, which you can see at the bottom of the map here. And a delay might also cause him to lose a reward for timely completion of the mission, a point that was overemphasized in the Brando movie. As the Bounty made its way to the Cape, Bligh put the men on 2/3 rations, saving costs which would accrue to his benefit at the voyage's end, but was never popular with the sailors. Then on March 9th, 1788, Bligh administered his first lashing. Bligh had boasted that he had no intention of lashing anyone on the entire voyage, and was reasonably pleased with himself to this point, and quite disappointed that he had to do it. The man receiving the lash was Matthew Quintal, probably the most despicable member of the Bounty's crew. When the Bounty reached the Cape in mid-March of 1788, the seas were horrendous. Many times, Bligh tried to force the Bounty through the tempests, but each time the Bounty failed to penetrate past the Cape. After 30 days, remember, 30 days of going through tempests like these, Bligh decided to turn around and headed toward the Cape of Good Hope. As recorded by boatswain's mate James Morrison, on the 18th of April, Mr. Bligh ordered all hands aft, and after returning them his thanks for their unremitted attention to their duty, informed them of his intention to bear away for the Cape of Good Hope, as it appeared to him an impossibility to get around Cape Horn. This was received with universal joy and returned, according to custom, with 3 cheers. Huzzah! So things are okay at this point in time. Now, this episode was ignored in the Lawton Gable movie. There, at the southern tip of Africa, the Bounty had to undergo repairs and refitting. 38 days later, the Bounty sailed to the east, and none of the movies show this respite. But while the Bounty's log conveyed optimism and success, other sources were not quite so sanguine. In James Morrison's narrative, we find several events unrecorded in the Bligh log. Shortly after leaving England, Bligh discovered, if you will, that 2 cheeses were missing, and a version of this episode finds its way into both the Brando and the Lawton movie. He assembled his crew to rail at them. On opening the casks, 2 cheeses were missed by Mr. Bligh, who declared that they were stolen. The cooper declared that the cask had been opened before, while the ship was in the river, by Mr. Samuel's order, and the cheeses sent to Mr. Bligh's house. Mr. Bligh, without making any further inquiry into the matter, ordered the allowance of cheese to be stopped and told the cooper he would give him a damned good flogging if he said any more about it. Then afterwards, John Williams declared that he had carried the cheeses to Mr. Bligh's house with a cask of vinegar, and Bligh flew into a rage. Rages, his intemperate language, would be the defining character of Bligh's leadership. Bligh had loaded a quantity of pumpkin. Bligh insisted that the men consume 1 pound of pumpkin in lieu of 2 pounds of bread. This they refused. Bligh came up in a violent passion and called all hands, telling them, let him see who would dare to refuse it, saying, you damned infernal scoundrels, I'll make you eat grass or anything you can catch before I have done with you. When challenged by the Bounty's master, John Fryer, he flew into another rage. It was therefore needless to make any complaint, for they would get no redress, as he was the fittest judge of what was right or wrong. He further added that he would flog the first man severely who would dare attempt to make any complaint in future, and dismiss them with severe threats. So Morrison's narrative reveals an intemperate Bligh, and though no lashes were administered, significant threat was prevalent. Then we have wheat and barley were now boiled every morning for breakfast in lieu of the bargoo. Now, bargoo was a stew. The stew was going to have meat and vegetables and some of the other things that are carried on the ship. Here it's only wheat and barley. But of this, the quantity was so small, it was no uncommon thing for 4 men in a mess to draw lots for the breakfast, meaning that one or more would go without breakfast that day because there wouldn't be enough to satisfy them. Now, limiting rations or quality of food was probably not an uncommon practice in the Navy, and these instances appear, but not in their proper places, in Lawton and slightly differently in the Brando movie. The Bounty left Cape Town for Tahiti on July 1st, and then Morrison recorded that on the sea between Australia and Tahiti were sown the seeds of eternal discord between Lieutenant Bligh and his officers. He confined the carpenter and found fault with the inattention of the rest. Then again, at a later date, during this passage, Mr. Bligh and his messmates, the master, John Fryer, and surgeon, Thomas Huggan, fell out and separated, each taking his part of the stock and retiring to live in their own cabins. They would no longer interact with Bligh during meals. Then just before arriving at Tahiti, Bligh had a conflict with Fryer. Fryer had refused to sign the account books. Bligh had all hands called aft and the articles of war read, which was a very serious proceeding which could have led to court-martial and worse. After which the books were produced with a pen and ink, and Mr. Bligh said, "Now, sir, sign them books." The master took the pen and said, "I sign in obedience to your orders, but this may be canceled hereafter," and you can imagine what that does for morale. Now, in the Lawton Gable movie, it is Christian, Clark Gable, who was forced to do the signing. Now, episodes such as these are omitted from the Hopkins movie, as they would have reflected too poorly on Bligh. Again, that's a revisionist view. And now these episodes, of course, add to the impending friction that is about to take place. The Bounty reached Matavai Bay in Tahiti on October 26, 1788. It had sailed over 27,000 miles in 10 months. Here you have a map of Tahiti, which you can see. Now, this is Matavai Bay over here. This is Point Venus, which is where Cook did his measurements of the transit of Venus. And so they're encamped over here. Bligh assigned men to the shore party to collect, of course, the breadfruit plants. The lead officer on the shore party was Fletcher Christian. In the Lawton Gable film, Bligh forces Christian to remain on the ship. More dramatic friction and, of course, fiction. The shore party became quite friendly with the natives. Many of the men went natives themselves, getting tattooed and having relationships with the native women who very freely offered their sexual favors. Now here, Bligh felt compelled to apply lashes to the back of William Musprat. We'll hear his name several times more throughout this talk, for allowing the theft of one of the launches. Bligh recorded, "I thought it would have a good effect to punish the boatkeeper in there, the Tahitian's presence, and accordingly I ordered a dozen lashes. It did not have the intended effect. The natives expressed their opposition to lashing into Bligh most fervently." Now on the right, you see that's a still from the Brando movie. On the left, if you recognize him, that's Errol Flynn. That was a Bounty movie called In the Wake of the Bounty, which is available to be seen on YouTube if you're so interested. It was the first movie that Flynn was in. So in this paradise of ample food, ample women, gorgeous sunshine, and tropical plants, three of the men, not surprisingly, sought to hide. Charles Churchill, John Millward, and our friend Musprat had secretly taken the Bounty's cutter, one of the ships that was carried on the Bounty, while midshipman Thomas Hayward, not to be confused with Peter Haywood, two separate persons, was asleep on watch. The three men were recaptured, put in irons for a month, and then given lashes. Churchill received 24, while Millward and Musprat received 48. Ouch. Hayward was put in irons for 19 days, then released with a severe scolding. The sailors brought hogs on board the Bounty that had been the subject of trade between them and the Tahitians, but Mr. Bligh seized on all that came to the ship, big and small, dead or alive, taking them as his property. Fryer complained, telling Bligh that the seized hogs belonged to the men who had traded for them. According to Morrison, Bligh told Fryer that he, Mr. Bligh, would convince him that everything was his as soon as it was on board, and that he would take 9/10 of any man's property and let him see who dared say anything to the contrary. And the natives, seeing Bligh's conduct, stopped selling hogs to the men. The time had come to leave. Bligh had 1,015 breadfruit plants loaded onto the boat, boarded on a special deck, which you can see here. And you can see the layout of the ship, how the pots were arranged for carrying the breadfruit plants. And then the ship departed Matavai Bay on April 4th, 1789. The Bounty stopped at Tonga to reprovision over here. Then on April 25th, 1789, the Bounty pointed its prow in the direction of the Cape of Good Hope. On the night of April 27th, according to Bligh's log, everything seemed peaceful. Bligh retired to his cabin. Fletcher Christian took his watch at 4 a.m. the morning of the 28th. Now in the book, by Greg Denning, Mr. Bligh's Bad Language, he compares the lashings ordered by Bligh to the lashings ordered by the other ship's captains. You know that both the Lawton movie and the Brando movie, there were lashings galore. Bligh did not necessarily want to inflict corporal punishment, for he wrote in his log 3 months into the voyage, "Until this afternoon, I had hoped I could have performed the voyage without punishment to anyone." Bligh, though not close to number one, did lash, and his journey was aborted by the mutiny. So the number you see here is probably understated, but it's still less than others. It's been argued that lashing was an expectation of a British sailor, but I doubt that it made it any less painful. And the sailors' reaction shown in the movies to the lashings rarely occurred. And the Bounty's problems did not stem from lashings or even threatened lashings. A near contemporary, Sir John Barrow, wrote, "Lieutenant Bligh's character never stood high in the Navy for suavity of manners or mildness of temper. His temper was irritable in the extreme." Bligh had a brutally foul mouth and an uncontrollable temper. Could this have led to what happened in our next chapter? Chapter 2, the Mutiny. Now, there are a few things certain about the morning of April 28th, 1789, but one thing is certain: Fletcher Christian led a mutiny, and several members of the crew acted in concert with Christian. Since the initiation of the mutiny is the most fascinating and the most mysterious aspect of all the information I am going to offer you, let us hold its details or its guesses until the end of this history. Right now, we will look at the broad outlines of the taking of the Bounty. When Bligh awoke on the morning of the 28th, he felt the hands of Charles Churchill, John Mills, Thomas Burkitt, and Fletcher Christian pressing down upon him. They pulled Bligh up and bound his hands behind his back. As the half-naked Bligh was pushed upstairs, he passed an armed Alexander Smith, John Sumner, and Matthew Quintal, who guarded the steps. Every time Bligh shouted, he was threatened with death. Men were reported as saying, "Damn his eyes, put him in the boat and let the bugger see if he can live on 3/4 of a pound of yams a day." And "Mr. Bligh has brought all this upon himself." And Bligh heard one villain say to the other, "Blow his brains out." Other men were rounded up to be sent off with Bligh. Now, Christian intended to set Bligh into the Bounty's cutter, which was one of the ships on the boat, capable of holding only 8 or 10 men. It was worm-eaten and decayed. Fryer, the master, Purcell, the carpenter, and Cole, the boatswain, objected, saying it was not fit, and urged Christian to use the larger launch. Christian agreed, and the launch was lowered into the water. Fryer, midshipmen Thomas Hayward and John Hallett were forced into the launch. Did they prefer Christian, or did they fear certain death in the launch? Others loyal to Bligh were placed in the launch, totaling 19 occupants. But not everyone who wanted to go could join Bligh. Charles Norman, Thomas McIntosh, and Joseph Coleman were detained against their will. Later, others would claim they too had wanted to go with Bligh. The blind fiddler, Michael Byrne, Peter Heywood, James Morrison, William Muspratt. But there was not room in the launch for additional bodies. The Bounty mutineers supplied the loyalists with twine, canvas, lines, sails, cordage, and a 28-gallon cask of water. They dropped in 16 pieces of pork weighing 2 pounds each. John Samuel, Bligh's clerk, bought 150 pounds of bread, 6 quarts of rum, 6 bottles of wine with Bligh's log and some of his papers. Bligh was given a sextant, quadrant, and compass, and 4 cutlasses were dropped into the launch. The Bounty launch having been lowered, Bligh, loyalists lowered into it, Christian said, "Come, Captain Bligh, your officers and men are now in the boat, and you must go with them." Bligh turned to Christian. "Consider, Mr. Christian, you have danced my children upon your knee." And Christian replied, "That, Captain Bligh, is the thing. I am in hell. I am in hell." Bligh was forced over and down into the launch, and off went the Bounty's launch. Then the Bounty sailed away, leaving the launch and its 19 occupants behind. 2.5 hours had passed since the waking of Bligh and the departure from the launch. There is no record that Bligh shouted, as did Lawton, "I will see you, all of you, hanging from the highest yardarm in the British fleet." He was recorded as saying to those on board the Bounty who professed loyalty, "Never fear, my lads, I'll do you justice if I ever reach England." But we shall see the British Navy's version of justice. Now, Bligh believed the pleasures of Tahiti were responsible for the mutiny. The mutineers had flattered themselves with the hopes of a more happy life among the Otaheitians than they could possibly enjoy in England, and this, joined to some female connections, most probably occasioned the transaction. But Master John Fryer recorded that Christian did not have a steady female companion, adding only that 2 men did. Morrison recorded, "Everybody seemed in high spirits and began already to talk of home, of fixing the length of the passage and count up their wages, and one would readily have imagined that we had just left Jamaica instead of Tahiti. So far onward did their flattering fancies waft them." Morrison getting very poetic in his journal. But here we have one of the many ambiguities surrounding this most interesting story. Now, here you have, as Bligh left the Bounty, you see Bligh kept a log of who the mutineers were. So here you see Fletcher Christian with a description. Then you see George Stewart with the description, Peter Hayward here with his description, and then Edward Young here. And Bligh kept a log of all the men who stayed behind on the Bounty. But how impetuous was the mutiny? You must wait for that answer, if there is one. Chapter 3, The Incredible Journey of the Bounty's Launch. While Bligh's depiction as a rather harsh ship's captain has tainted his reputation, his command of the Bounty launch is one of the greatest sea exploits ever recorded. Not that he was not harsh in the launch. Fryer reported that Bligh was as tyrannical in his temper in the boat as in the ship, but his total command of the situation allowed him to, well, let us look at that journey. The launch, all 23 feet 9 inches with a beam of 6 feet 9 inches and a depth of 2 feet 9 inches, drifted away from the Bounty with only 7 inches of freeboard, a terribly small amount for anything that might be a tempestuous sea. Bligh set a heading for Tofua, which you see here, believing that he would be able to provision the boat. Landing there on April 29th, Bligh assigned men to hunt breadfruit and fresh water, and this is roughly the area on Tofua where Bligh landed the launch. Over several days, natives began to congregate, then threaten. Then on May 2nd, sensing an imminent attack, Bligh ordered the men back into the launch. As the natives attacked, John Norton, Bligh's quartermaster, here you can see him here, stood his ground near the boat, and the natives stoned him to death. Feeling terror and determination, the men feverishly rowed the launch and eventually sailed away from Tofua. Bligh had to decide where to go. The only reasonable sanctuary was Kupang, a Dutch settlement on Timor. Now, just let me point out here, the launch now is off, the map here you see is off to the right. And here you can see Timor over here. And here you see a blow up of Timor with Kupang on the western side of the island. Where they were to Kupang was 3,500 miles. Yet to a man, each one supported Bligh's decision. Now, Bligh had only a sextant and a compass and a quadrant, and one of the men had with him a timepiece, which would help him with navigation. Distance covered was measured by timing the travel of a log on a line thrown into the water. Fortunately, the difference in latitude between the launch and Kupang was not great, so Bligh could sustain a westerly heading with advantageous easterly winds. And again, you can see here, they're roughly over here off the side of the map, and you can see latitudinally how close they are to where Kupang is. Now, Bligh instituted a strict rationing of food using a scale made of coconut halves and a bullet. He would weigh out 1 ounce of bread and dole out the daily ration of a quarter of a pint of water. On May 3rd, a severe tropical storm assailed the launch. The boat wallowed, and Bligh ordered all superfluous clothing, rope, and sail thrown overboard. On days when fear tormented the men, Bligh would dole out a ration of rum. They were constantly wet, and nighttime temperatures chilled their exposed bodies as fall turned toward winter. Keep in mind, they are south of the equator. On the 6th, they hooked a fish, but it got away. Even more torment. When they spotted land, fear of native attack kept them from approaching. Half the men kept watch, while the other half slept on the boat's wet floor. Now, each day was a repeat of the previous day, except their discomfort grew, and when it rained, the men would bail frantically, although they were able to replenish their fresh water. By the 10th of May, the bread ration was reduced to 1/25 of a pound, served in the morning, at noon, and at sunset. Occasionally, they would dip into the pork. By the 17th, most men begged for a greater portion, but Bligh refused. By the 20th, some of the men seemed to be half dead. When the sun shone after a 15-day hiatus, the warmth helped them recover. On May 24th, Bligh calculated that he had bread allowances to last for 29 days. He could probably reach Kupang by then, but uncertain that he could be certain, he refused to increase the ration. He wrote that the men, quote, cheerfully agreed to his proposal, unquote. But it's important to emphasize that Bligh's log reflects much more optimism than the men later reported. We'll see some of that. Then on the 25th, a bird the size of a large pigeon called a noddy, you can see the noddy on the left here, was captured. Bligh divided it into 18 separate portions. In other words, they tore the bird apart into 18 separate portions, and it was randomly allocated among the men, eaten bones, beak, feet, all except feathers. The Hopkins-Gibson version shows an example of how they did this. The same day, the men snagged a booby, which you see on the right here, a larger bird, and shared it the same way. They caught another on the 26th. Then 2 days later, they grabbed two. They emptied the bird's stomach of undigested fish, and they saved the fish for another day's meal. They made landfall on May 28th after they safely passed through the Great Barrier Reef. And here you can see the lighter color is the reef demarcation. Here you can on the map on the left you can see sort of the reef area here. This is Cape Tribulation in Australia. They came to what they named Restoration Island. They found oysters and an ample supply of fresh water. In their toolkit, they had tinder and a small magnifying glass and were able to build a very comforting fire. One of the men produced a small copper pot in which they cooked oysters, pork, and bread. And you can only imagine what a hot meal must have tasted like after the month they had just experienced. They next substituted palm hearts for bread. But then, seeing armed natives beginning to congregate, they fled the island. And between May 28th and June 2nd, the launch island hopped. So you can see a little more detail over here. There are a number of islands in this area, and the launch went from island to island. On these islands, they found clams, and David Nelson, the botanist, identified an edible bean. On yet another island sent out on for birds, they caught 12 small ones. This stay with ample food, ample sleep, and ample exercise contributed to their ability to continue on toward Kupang. On June 3rd, they again passed into open ocean. You can see here. They grabbed a bird one day and they managed to snag a fish on another, but each of the men seemed to be failing, and symptoms included an extreme weakness, swelled legs, hollow and ghastly countenances, a more than common inclination to sleep with an apparent debility of understanding, obviously traditional starvation symptoms. Then on June 12th, after 47 days of sailing over 3,600 miles, the men sighted the island of Timor. They pulled into Kupang Harbor on the 14th. Most had arrived near death. Our bodies were nothing but skin and bones. Our limbs were full of sores, and we were clothed in rags. In this condition, with tears of joy and gratitude flowing down our cheeks, the people of Timor beheld us with a mixture of horror, surprise, and pity. It has been estimated that the launch's occupants ate an average of 350 calories a day over the 47 days. Keeping in mind, it would probably take a minimum of 2,000 calories a day just to sustain you. It consisted, for example, of 7 pounds of bread. This is the totality over the period. 1 pound of salted pork, 2 coconuts, 1 pint of coconut milk, 1 banana, 1 1/4 raw seabirds, and 4 ounces of fish. On the 5 days on the islands off Australia, they each ate 4 pints of oysters and clams, hearts of palm, berries, and some wild beans, and some small seabirds. Meager indeed. David Nelson, the botanist, died in Kupang. After a short period of recuperation, Bligh and his 16 men were transported from Kupang to Batavia. Batavia is now Jakarta. And the following men died in Batavia: William Elphinstone, Peter Linkletter, and Thomas Hall. Robert Lamb died on the way to Cape Town. So far, the mutiny had cost 6 lives. Ultimately, Bligh secured a ship and sailed back to England, where he arrived on March 14th, 1790, and reported the mutiny. Now, the Lawton film shows some of the launch's trials, greatly abbreviated. For some reason, the Brando version omitted the voyage of the launch, and the Hopkins version showed some of the incidents, but also greatly abbreviated, and none of the movies showed any of the deaths. As with any captain who's lost his ship, Bligh was court-martialed. He was acquitted. In the Brando film, and to a lesser extent in the Lawton film, the court-martial castigates Bligh. Never happened. As in the Hopkins film, Bligh was given kudos for piloting the launch, and Bligh became, at that point in time, a national hero. Undoubtedly, Bligh's transit of the Pacific and Indian Oceans in a 23-foot boat with 17 other men crammed into its small space was one of the greatest small boat exploits in the history of navigation, matched only by Shackleton's voyage of the James Caird across the Antarctic Ocean. Bligh deserves every accolade that can be heaped on him for this, but not all the men were happy with him, even though they survived, and at some point they would paint a very different picture of the event. Chapter 4. Where did the Bounty go? After abandoning Bligh on the launch, the Bounty looked for a place to hide, knowing that the Navy would probably come looking for them. Into the ocean went 1,015 breadfruit plants. Christian guided the ship to Tubai, but met with native hostility. They landed over here, this Bay Saint Juan, Bloody Bay, but met with native hostility. The Bounty sailed to Tahiti, then returned to Tubai with 30 Tahitians and ample livestock for a settlement. They attempted to live with an unwelcoming populace. Not everyone was happy with Christian's leadership. Christian found that John Sumner and Matthew Quintal were gone on shore without leave. He inquired how they'd come to go on shore without his leave. They answered, "The ship is moored, and we are now our own masters." Upon which he, Christian, clapped a pistol to one of their heads, which he always kept in his pocket, and said, "I'll let you know who is master." And Christian, perhaps, began to understand Bligh. After a fight with the Tubuaians, in which 16 natives were killed, they had to abandon Tubuai. Returning to Tahiti, Thomas McIntosh, Charles Coleman, and Michael Byrne, Bligh loyalists, chose to remain there. They felt secure that if the Navy arrived, they would be spared harsh treatment. Joseph Coleman, the armorer, whose metalworking skills were very important, another Bligh loyalist, was detained on the Bounty against his will. However, just as the Bounty was sailing away, he dived overboard and swam to Tahiti. Oddly, mutineer Charles Churchill chose to remain. So did mutineer Matthew Thompson. Neither saw England or anywhere else ever again. Thompson shot Churchill. Churchill's Tahitian friends pummeled Thompson with stones. 2 more dead in Paradise, total 8. So 14 of the remaining men had remained on Tahiti. These 9 men, Fletcher Christian, Edward Young, Alexander Smith, John Williams, John Mills, William Brown, Isaac Martin, William McCoy, and Matthew Quintal, certainly an odd mix of men, not all of whom got along with Christian, took the Bounty and left the delightful shores of Tahiti to disappear for 20 years. Chapter 5, Retrieval, Wreck, and Return. The Admiralty assigned the ship Pandora under the command of a man who would make Bligh look like a saint, Edward Edwards, to bring the evildoers back to England. Now, in the Lawton movie, Bligh is shown in charge of the Pandora, but he was elsewhere. The Pandora reached Tahiti in March of 1791. The mutineers' 2-year reprieve in Paradise ended. Once in Edward's clutches, they would experience a hell worse than the best of Paradise. On seeing the Pandora afloat in Mutiny Bay, Joseph Coleman, then Peter Heywood, then George Stewart rushed out to greet the crew. They were immediately clapped into irons. Shortly after, every remaining member of the Bounty was captured. Even those loyal to Bligh, Joseph Coleman, Thomas McIntosh, Charles Norman, and Michael Byrne, were chained. They were all worthless as far as Edwards was concerned. He built a prison on the Pandora's quarterdeck, 11 feet by 18 feet and barely 6 foot high, and all 14 of the men were confined in that space, confined and chained. The Pandora's crew was forbidden to speak with them, and if the sentinels heard any of the prisoners speaking in Tahitian, they were ordered to shoot the speaker. The Pandora hunted for the Bounty. Christian, knowing that if the mutineers on Tahiti were captured, they would probably be asked where the Bounty sailed, had hinted that the Bounty would be heading northwest. Edwards took the bait. The Pandora never encountered the Bounty. Christian had sailed in the opposite direction. After 3 months of fruitlessly searching for the Bounty, Edwards relinquished the pursuit. And here they are in Tahiti, wandering around, and then all these islands around it here. Then he starts heading back this way. The Pandora approached the Great Barrier Reef, and Edwards totally misread the route he needed to take. Now, Bligh had predicted that Edwards would not be able to make it through the Great Barrier Reef. So what happens on August 29th, 1791? Edwards wrecked the Pandora on the reef. And there you can see a sketch by Peter Heywood. As the Pandora went down, Edwards ignored the plight in the prisoner's box, except for Coleman, McIntosh, and Norman, whom he released to work the pumps. The other 11 remained imprisoned and enchained. Each begged to be released. In response, Edwards placed 2 more armed sentinels over the box with orders to shoot if anyone tried to escape. Luckily, the master-at-arms dropped the key into the box as he fled the ship. The prisoners unlocked and most of them escaped. But it was too late for John Sumner, Richard Skinner, George Stewart, and Henry Hilbrand. Unable to get out of the box, they drowned. Now, 12 members of the Bounty crew were dead. Also, Edwards ignored the plight of his master-at-arms and the sentinels, allowing them to drown as they stood guarding Pandora's box. All told, Edwards' inept leadership led to the deaths of 35 men, the 4 mutineers, and 31 of his crew. Yet he was never punished and was discharged at court-martial, and can one escape the conviction that he should have been tried for murder? Lawyer talking. The surviving crew and prisoners were allocated among the Pandora's 4 boats. They needed to cover only 1,000 miles, because here's the site of the wreck over here, and would basically follow Bligh's path, although they were much better equipped than Bligh was. They reached Kupang on September 15th. After recuperating for 3 weeks, they sailed off toward Batavia, and ultimately Edwards returned the prisoners to England, arriving June 19th, 1792. In England, each man remained a prisoner, even loyalists Coleman, McIntosh, Norman, and Byrne. The British Navy gave them no relief, despite whatever promise Bligh might have made. So what happens? Chapter 6, The court-martial. Led by Admiral Samuel Hood, the court-martial commenced on September 12th, and it ended on September 18th. The photo on the left is a still from the Lawton movie. That's Franchot Tone, Roger Byam, Peter Heywood, talking to the court-martial aboard the ship, the Duke. Bligh's official statement and log were read into the record. Not being present at the hearing, he could not be questioned. John Fryer, William Cole, William Purcell, William Peckover, Thomas Hayward, and Thomas Hallett testified. Each concentrated on what they remembered of the mutiny, who had actively taken part, who had opposed, and who stood idly by while it took place. Each defendant then had the opportunity to question the witnesses. The Navy preferred not to allow attorneys to appear on behalf of the accused, probably afraid of attorneys, can't blame them. However, an accused could have the assistance of an attorney in preparing his case. So the question developed by the defendants was, did they resist or did not participate? Now, resistance would have meant acquittal. Lack of participation would not have ameliorated guilt, but because being neutral in the face of a mutiny was equivalent to being guilty, but some appearance of neutrality might have ameliorated punishment. Each defendant then had the opportunity to make a statement and call witnesses. Coleman, the armorer, spoke and called Cole, who supported his claim of innocence. Byrne spoke and called Fryer, and while Fryer did not clearly absolve Byrne, his blindness would guarantee acquittal. Norman and McIntosh made their statements and offered an exculpatory letter from Bligh. Then Ellison, who was 15 at the time, offered what he thought would be exculpatory evidence, calling attention to his inexperience and age. As I mentioned, he was only 15. Burkett, who had been identified by Bligh as one of the men standing over him on the morning of the 28th, gave a lengthy and vivid description of what happened that day, then called Fryer, Cole, Peckover, and Hallett, none of whom could swear that Burkett was unarmed, but spoke of his good character. And Millward attempted to defend himself, called one witness, Cole, who could not support his claims. Musprat, the man who was lashed a couple of times in Tahiti, was assisted by a lawyer, and through a very clever legal stratagem, he sought to call co-defendants Byrne and Norman. The court-martial refused the request. The judge advocate then read Musprat's prepared statement, another cleverly constructed legal device. He attacked the testimony of Purcell and Hallett, who had damned him through their testimony. Morrison's statement was well written, well argued, noting evidence that demonstrated his reluctance to participate in the mutiny, and all the logical reasons why he should not be considered a mutineer. He attacked the testimony of Hayward and Hallett, delving into their cowardice on that morning, then called Cole and Purcell, and both gave favorable character references. Then there was Peter Heywood, who had naval connections and wealth, and had several very prominent lawyers aiding him. One of his attorneys read his carefully edited statement. The difficulties of youth, the confusion of the situation, the impossibility of joining the overcrowded launch. He asserted that he went below to collect his things, but was prevented from coming up. Fryer, Cole, Purcell, and Peckover supported some of his claims, but did not completely exonerate his behavior. Ultimately, the four remaining loyalists, Coleman, McIntosh, Norman, and the blind fiddler Michael Byrne, were found not guilty and discharged. Though clearly innocent, they had been in bondage for over 18 months. 18 months. British justice, naval justice. As for the remaining defendants, the charges had been proved against the said Peter Heywood, James Morrison, Thomas Ellison, Thomas Burkett, John Millward, and William Musprat, and the court-martial did adjudge them and each of them to suffer death by being hanged by the neck. The court added, in consideration of various circumstances, the court did most earnestly recommend said Peter Heywood and James Morrison to His Majesty's royal mercy. Ellison, Millward, Burkett, and Musprat received the ultimate sentence with no hope, but William Musprat and his clever attorney filed a petition as soon as the verdict was announced, claiming that he had been denied the opportunity to call witnesses. The king, who's George III, Mad King George, pardoned Hayward and Morrison on October 24th, and one can only imagine what that 5-week wait period was like for them, waiting to see if they'd get pardoned. Musprat's petition was granted, which meant that he would have gone through another hearing, but the king then pardoned Musprat as well. Ellison, Burkett, and Millward were hanged on October 29th. The number of bounty dead had now reached 15. Now, in the Lawton Gable, The Mutiny on the Bounty, Haywood was fictionalized as Roger Bryan. He is shown fighting against immunity. Never happened. He gave a moving speech at movie's end in support of the proposition with which the movie started, but that never happened. Brutal captaincy and flogging did not end with the mutiny on the Bounty, though this mutiny led to others that would have a greater impact. One other point. Bligh made a second voyage to take breadfruit to the West Indies, which is why he was not in attendance at the court-martial, and that voyage succeeded. But the ultimate irony, the enslaved population refused to eat the breadfruit. Yet again, a mission failure. Slavery also affected the legend of William Bligh. It was the abolitionists, led by Fletcher Christian's brother Edward, who would turn Bligh from a naval hero to a pariah, to the point that one writer on the Bounty story, an admiral himself, described Bligh's tyrannical conduct, harsh and opprobrious language, ungovernable passion, and a worrying and harassing temper, and capricious and arbitrary command. So much for the good hero Bligh. But we are still not at the end of the story on the mutiny of the Bounty, for no one had any idea where Christian and his mutineers were. Chapter 7. Where is Fletcher Christian, or the beatification of Alexander Smith? The Bounty left Tahiti abruptly on September 21st, 1789, and disappeared into the Pacific. And like Dante's Ulysses, it was as though they had sailed off the ends of the earth. And for all intents and purposes, they had. When Fletcher Christian, with Edward Young, John Williams, John Mills, William Brown, and Isaac Martin, William McCoy, Matthew Quintal, and Alexander Smith left Tahiti in the Bounty, with them were 6 Polynesian men, 11 Tahitian women. Christian had set sail in the dark without warning. Where, oh where, could they have gone? 19 years later, on February 6, 1808, an American sealer, the Topaz, under the command of the man you see here, Mayhew Folger, sighted an uncharted island in the Pacific. Folger realized that it was probably Pitcairn Island, and that it had been wrongly charted many years before. It was charted in the middle of the 18th century, before the development of the Harrison chronometer, which enabled highly accurate calculations of longitude. So this was charted more than 3 degrees of longitude off. Folger was surprised when he saw a canoe paddle out to the Topaz. As the canoe paddled alongside, Folger asked, "Who are you?" He was dumbfounded when the paddlers who came aboard said, "We are Englishmen." "Folger, where were you born?" "Young man, on that island which you see." "Folger, how can you be Englishmen if you were born on that island?" "Young man, we are Englishmen because our father is an Englishman." "Folger, who is your father?" "Young man, Alec." "Folger, who was Alec?" "Young man, don't you know Alec?" "Folger, how should I know Alec?" Folger was stunned when the young man asked, "Well then, do you know Captain Bligh of the Bounty?" Folger went ashore to meet a thriving community, mostly women, some young men, younger children, and a 40-year-old man who called himself John Adams. While Adams' name aroused no surprise in Folger, the name of the young man was quite surprising. Thursday, October, Christian. The name Christian was universally known. Folger slowly realized who he had just encountered. Adams explained that Christian, almost by accident, after the Bounty wandered the Pacific for 4 months, near a large rocky island. So they left Tahiti, they came down here, wandered around, and then came across this degree of latitude, ultimately coming to this large rocky island. This island had not been charted, but it fit the description of another rock that maps had located more than 200 miles away over in this area here. Christian intuited that it was Pitcairn Island. A wrongly charted island would be a reasonably safe haven. It offered arable ground, fresh water, food, and ample space to build a community. They unloaded the Bounty. Then Matthew Quintal set fire to the ship, and the remnants of the ship languished for 200 years under Bounty Bay. The crew members chose places to build homes. They allocated the women among the men, and herein lay one of the problems. There were not enough women to supply each of the men with a companion. All the Bounty's crew considered themselves superior to the natives and entitled to any woman. So some of the native men did not have a woman companion. When the woman who had been attached to John Williams died, Williams demanded that he be given one of the natives' wives, and this further increased the existing friction. The land was divided 9 ways among only the Englishmen. The natives received no allocation of land, another point of friction. 3 of the native men began plotting against the Englishmen, but their plot was revealed by Williams' new wife. The mutineers killed 2 of the natives and allowed the other to live. But the 4 remaining native men were whipped, they were tortured, they were hung up in irons, they were basically treated like slaves. 2 ultimately fled into the forest and then secretly plotted with the other 2. They got their hands onto 4 muskets, each one of them carrying a musket, snuck up behind Christian and shot him in the back while he was gardening, then battered his body. One by one, on September 20th or possibly October 3rd, it's not clear when, 1793, they executed Williams, then Mills, then Martin, then Brown. Adams and Young were wounded but protected by the women. McCoy fled with Quintal into the mountains. The number of Bounty dead had reached 20. The women set out to destroy the native men. One of the women axed the man with whom she was sleeping. Another was shot by Young, assisted by one of the women. The third, who fled from an avenging woman, ran into McCoy and Quintal, who quickly dispatched him. And the fourth had been killed by one of his co-conspirators. Now, all the native men were dead. McCoy, probably suffering from delirium tremens, from overindulgence and some home-brewed alcohol, ultimately jumped to his death in 1797. Quintal became even more erratic after McCoy's death. Adams and Young clubbed him to death after inviting him to their residence. The Bounty dead had now reached 22. Thereafter, Adams and Young taught the islanders to read using the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. By 1800, John Adams was the sole surviving remaining mutineer and the spiritual leader of this very strange community. Now, Adams retold his story to ships visiting this unique community. The story would change, or the character's place in the story would change, but the basic outline I have presented here of terrible disputes and violent anger, of suicide and revenge, all comport with what Adams told of various ships that had stopped at Pitcairn. But who is John Adams? The sole survivor of the Bounty crew had enlisted as Alexander Smith, probably to conceal his real identity. At the end of the slaughter, only Edward Young and he survived among the males. Edward Young died December 25th, 1800, of probably severe asthma. That left Smith, now Adams, as the patriarch of a society of Tahitian women and mutineers' children. A simple count of those who stayed on Tahiti and were captured by the Pandora, those who had launched with Bligh, those who had gone with Fletcher Christian, shows that by 1800, Christian's mutiny had taken the lives of 23 of the 43 members of the Bounty's crew. What do we make of this romanticized story? Bligh wanted to be an ideal captain, but fell far short of that mark. Not as bad as the movies have depicted, but far worse than his most enthusiastic defenders have painted. As for Fletcher Christian, whatever his motives, whatever his reasons, he set in motion a chain of events that took the lives of over half the crew of His Majesty's armed vessel, Bounty. Which brings us to Chapter 8. Can we solve the mysteries of the mutiny on the Bounty? So here we are at the end of a fascinating story. At least I hope you found this to be a fascinating story. Incredible in its details and in its mysteries. Whose version of events is most accurate? Bligh's, Morrison's, Haywood's, Fryer's? How do we unravel the differing Pitcairn stories? What are the mutiny and its mysteries, and why, yes, why did the 25-year-old Fletcher Christian lead the mutiny? That he initiated it is the clearest fact about the mutiny. How or why has not been told consistently. Ultimately, unfortunately, we have no direct evidence from Christian, but let us back up to some key events. After his pardon, Peter Hayward wrote to Christian's brother Edward, Fletcher was not the vile wretch void of all gratitude which the world has the unkindness to think of him, but on the contrary, a most worthy character, ruined only by the misfortune, if it can be called, of being a young man of strict honor, adorned with every virtue, beloved by all except one whose ill report is greatest praise. So Haywood strikes an early blow at Bligh, but far from the only blow, and Edward Christian would strike many. Setting sail from Tahiti on April 21st, 1789, Bligh came on deck and found fault with Christian because in a squall he had not taken care of the sails. And at midnight of that day, Mr. Bligh and Mr. Christian had some words. When Mr. Christian told Mr. Bligh, Sir, your abuse is so bad that I cannot do my duty with any pleasure. I have been in hell for weeks with you. Now Bligh denied that he had quarrels with Christian, but Fryer testified that the two men had frequent quarrels. This is part of the Bounty mystique. Do you believe Bligh, as many of his apologists do, and dismiss the testimony of others? Or do you credit the testimony of the men who suffered under Bligh? On April 24th, the Bounty had stopped at Anamuka, a Tongan island, to fill casks of water. The crew members, led by Christian, were threatened by the natives. Bligh had ordered Christian that no person should affront the natives on any occasion. Morrison recorded. Mr. Christian, who had command of the watering party, found it difficult to carry on his duty. He informed Lieutenant Bligh, who damned him for a cowardly rascal, asking him if he was afraid of a set of naked savages while he had arms. To which Mr. Christian answered, the arms are no use while your orders prevent them from being used. When setting sail from the island, Bligh dismissed all the men under arms but two, but not before. He had passed a compliment on officers and men to tell them that they were a parcel of lubberly rascals and that he would disarm the whole of them, and presenting a pistol at William McCoy, threatened to shoot him for not paying attention. Now, having a gun pointed at one of the men's heads probably was way outside the scope of Navy discipline. And then on April 27th came the infamous coconut incident. It appears in the Lawton movie. It's not, for whatever reason, in the Brando movie. And then the Hopkins movie gives it a slightly altered, but also highly inaccurate view of the incident. Bligh was taking a turn around the deck when he decided to count coconuts. Then he announced that some had been stolen. Bligh called each officer before him. Each denied seeing anything taken. Bligh then accused the officers of having taken them. Mr. Christian answered, I do not know, sir, but I hope you don't think me so mean as to be guilty of stealing yours. Mr. Bligh replied, yes, you damned hound, I do. You must have stolen them from me, or you could give a better account of them. God damn you, you scoundrels. You are all thieves alike and combined with the men to rob me. I suppose you'll steal my yams next, but I'll sweat you for it, you rascals. I'll make half of you jump overboard before you get through Endeavor's streets. He then called Mr. Samuel and said, stop these villains, Grog, and give them but half a pound of yams tomorrow. And if they steal, then I'll reduce them to a quarter. The coconuts were carried aft, and he went below. The officers then got together and were heard to murmur much at such treatment. Purcell the carpenter recorded that he found Christian in tears. Fryer reported that Fletcher was devastated that Bligh had called him a thief in front of the entire crew. Then the evening of that day, the evening of the 27th, Bligh invited Christian to dinner, as he often did. But this evening, Fletcher declined, saying he did not feel well. About 11 p.m., Bligh came out on deck to talk to fire, then retired, and as was his custom, he left the door of his cabin unlocked. A story that emerged from the mists of Bounty lore is that Christian had decided to build a raft, which is implied in the Hopkins movie, that he had begun to gather the materials and asked for help. He would paddle a raft to one of the islands. Peter Hayward later recorded that Christian informed the boatswain, Cole, the carpenter, Purcell, and Stewart of his determination to leave the ship upon a raft on the night preceding the mutiny is certain, but he apparently changed his mind. Adams told the story this way. When Christian took his watch at 4 a.m., Stewart told him, "We are ripe for anything." Did Stewart plant the seed of the explosive action in a vulnerable Christian's mind? Morrison woke to learn that the ship had been taken by Christian. On deck, he found Bligh naked from the hips down, his hands tied behind him. Christian had a drawn bayonet or cutlass in his hand, and according to Morrison, his eyes flaming with revenge. Bligh later wrote to his wife, "He," meaning Christian, "with several others came into my cabin while I was asleep, and seizing me, holding naked bayonets at my breast, tied my hands behind my back and threatened instant destruction if I uttered a word. I, however, called loudly for assistance, but the conspiracy was so well laid that the officers' cabin doors were guarded by sentinels, so Nelson, Peckover, Samuels, or the master could not come to me. I was now dragged on deck in my shirt and closely guarded. I demanded of Christian the cause of such a violent act, but he could only answer, 'Not a word, sir, or you are dead.' I endeavored to rally someone to a sense of their duty, but to no effect." So exactly what happened between the calm of the evening of the 27th and the frenzy of the morning of the 28th? Bligh believed a conspiracy had been formed, the means had been concerted and prepared with so much secrecy and circumspection that no one circumstance appeared to occasion the smallest suspicion of the impending calamity. But in the launch, Bligh learned that none of the seamen with him, nor the messmates of Christian, Stewart, Hayward, and Young, had ever observed any circumstances that made them in the least suspect what was going on. Which leads to the question, was there a pre-planned, well-orchestrated mutiny or something else? Peter Hayward wrote this many years afterwards. The idea of attempting to take the ship had never entered Christian's distracted mind until the moment he relieved the deck and found his mate and midshipmen, Hayward and Hallett, sleeping. Hayward would have been one of the few men remaining on the Bounty with whom Christian would have been comfortable sharing confidences. There appeared to be no plan, only a quickly formulated reaction. Using the best possible guesses, how did it come about? Somewhere between the time that Christian thought of fleeing on his raft and that his morning thrust into Bligh's door, fully armed with several men, Christian must have conferred with some of the able seamen who, Charles Churchill, the Bounty's master-at-arms, John Mills, gunner's mate, and Thomas Burkett, able seaman, confronted Bligh in his cabin. Matthew Quintal, Isaac Martin, and Alexander Smith, fully armed, were seen outside the doors of those who Bligh presumed to be loyalists. That makes 7 mutineers. This is what Morrison wrote. Finding he could not take to his raft in the first and middle watches, Christian went to sleep about 3:30 in the morning. Now, his watch starts at 4 a.m., so he's not getting much sleep. When Mr. Stewart called him to relieve the watch, again, this is 4 a.m., he had not slept long and, in the italics are mine, was much out of order. And Stewart begged him not to attempt swimming away, saying, and again, the italics are mine, the people are ripe for anything. This made a forcible impression on his mind. And finding that Mr. Hayward, the mate of his watch, with whom he refused to discourse, soon went to sleep, and Mr. Hallett, the midshipman of his watch, not making his appearance, again, the italics are mine, he at once resolved to seize the ship. And disclosing his intention to Quintal and Martin, they called up Churchill and Thompson, then Smith, Williams, and McCoy. Williams and McCoy joined the list, 9 mutineers. Now, while the movie shows struggle amongst the men on board the Bounty while the mutiny unfolds, no such struggle took place. From this narrative, if it is to be credited, Fletcher Christian, highly stressed and suffering from inadequate sleep, received some form of encouragement from Stewart, had a quick conference with several crew members, and finding the assessment, regardless of who it came from, correct, determined to take command away from Bligh. As quick and as impetuous as that. Taking Morrison's count, only 9 men were actively involved in the mutiny. There were 42 crew members. Bligh had begged them to resist the mutiny, but no one did. Morrison added, no officers made the least attempt to rescue the ship, which would have been effected had any attempt been made by one of them. None seemed inclined to dispute the superiority, and Mr. Christian, at the head of 8 or 9 men, was permitted to proceed. John Fryer wrote that he attempted to get others to join in resistance to the mutiny, to try to regain the ship, but had little support and was threatened by the mutineers. As the participants died, with them went any knowledge of what they did or why, and no one ever got a sense of what led Fletcher Christian to this precipitous act, or why some of the men were so quick to follow him. It appears from almost every scrap of evidence that there was no concerted plan, no pre-meeting at which the men agreed to mutiny. And while Morrison's story is fairly succinct, from Adams, we get different tales. He at first probably afraid of being dragged back to England to suffer a mutineer's fate. Then, after being freed of any concern that he might be dragged back, he felt free to embellish. We learn much from him, but little of the reasons for Fletcher Christian undertaking, on the spur of the moment, an action that sealed the doom of so many. But he and Morrison are consistent on a number of points, including that no one tried to resist the mutiny, even though they outnumbered the mutineers. Unlike the movies, there was no fight, no attempt to oppose, just a passive attempt to dissuade Christian from doing what would, in the long run, be so costly. So, if we add to the 23 Bounty crew members who died, the 31 members of the Pandora crew who drowned in its wreck, the 6 Polynesian men slaughtered on Pitcairn, and the 2 Polynesian women who committed suicide while on Pitcairn, the number of dead resulting from the mutiny on the Bounty is 62. And if we add the 60 Tubians killed in the skirmish on that island, this amazing toll doubles. And it is quite a toll. So as badly as we want to solve the mysteries of the mutiny on the Bounty, we will never know for certain some key answers. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the true story of the mutiny on the Bounty. Frankly, it is far more interesting than any of the films. As Lord Byron said in his poem, Don Juan, "'Tis strange but true, for the truth is strange, stranger than fiction." There's a reading list that will be distributed for you of just some of the many, many, many books on the mutiny on the Bounty. And now I'll turn this back over to Cindy Jordan, who I met once or twice, and she will monitor questions coming in. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mark, for all of that great information about the movies and the true story of the mutiny on the Bounty. We do have one question here in the chat. Was Captain Bligh made governor of New South Wales as a reward or just to get rid of him? And a second question just came in sort of along the same lines. What was the later history of Captain Bligh? So maybe you can cover both of those.
Captain Bligh was not made, he wasn't relegated to New South Wales or Eastern Australia as a reward or punishment for the mutiny on the Bounty. He ultimately becomes an admiral. He fights in the war with France. He is involved in another mutiny called the Nor Mutiny. He's not directly responsible for it. But when he goes to Australia, Australia was pretty rugged, full of outlaws and stuff like that. The Australians didn't, and half of them were criminals anyway, or at least alleged criminals, that they didn't like his attempt to impose order or the way he tried to do it, and was then subjected to a mutiny there. But Bligh was rewarded. Like I said, became an admiral. And so while his reputation among a lot of people because of the mutiny was sort of in tatters, the British Navy didn't necessarily care that much about it. They knew what Bligh was on the ship. Some of the quotes I read from were by admirals associated with the British Navy, and they knew Bligh was the type of person he was, and were more than happy because he was probably nowhere near the worst of the British Navy's sea captains.
Okay. Here is a question from Megan, staying up late on the East Coast,
Hi, Megan.
asking, Mark, what is your favorite movie? And also, what happened to James Morrison? His account is simply fascinating.
My favorite movie is the original, The Mutiny on the Bounty with Lawton and Gable. Of course, it's the first one I ever saw. It's the one that got me interested in the Mutiny on the Bounty. It is an exceptionally good movie, even though factually, once you start looking at the real story of the Mutiny on the Bounty, it's not true. I mean, the opening scene shows Lawton as Bligh lashing a dead man. I mean, that never happened, and was lashed crazy on the trip. That never happened. So it's based allegedly on the Nordhoff and Hall book, and there's some similarities to the book, but there are some significant differences too. But the movie's a wonderful movie. The Brando movie, Brando is so bad in that movie, it's scary. And the Bounty movie is just sort of blah. It tells a story in a slightly different way. It's the revisionist look at Bligh. Oh, Bligh was really a nice guy. He wasn't a nice guy. Bligh didn't lash, which is true. So by far, the Mutiny on the Bounty is the best of those movies. What was the second part of the question from Megan?
What happened to
Morrison?
Morrison?
Okay, yeah. Well, Morrison stayed in the Navy. He remained really good friends with Peter Heywood. They exchanged a lot of information with each other about the story on the Mutiny on the Bounty. Morrison ultimately put together that manuscript on the Mutiny on the Bounty, and he died at sea when his ship went down in, I think it was 1807. He did remain with the Navy though. Peter Heywood ultimately became the pardoned mutineer, became a post captain, so his career didn't suffer from having been convicted at the court martial either.
Okay, there's some interest in the horticultural component of the voyage. How many different varieties of plants did they discover?
They probably didn't discover any per se. When Captain Cook made his first voyage, he brought Joseph Banks along and a Swedish botanist called Solander. And one of the places they stopped at was Tahiti. And so all the plant life was cataloged before the Bounty people got there. They did bring along a botanist, David Nelson. That was as much to take care of the breadfruit. They were there primarily for the breadfruit. They probably found some things, but I'm not a botanist, and other than knowing that they went to get breadfruit, and that on Pitcairn Island they took a plant called a tea and made this horrible liquor that drove them to distraction. I haven't paid that much attention to the botanical portion of this saga.
Okay, are there any relatives alive today of the people involved in the Mutiny on the Bounty?
Yes, there are relatives alive today. Bligh still has descendants. Bligh's descendants turned a lot of his papers over to the museum in Sydney, Australia. In 1990, I was there. They did have a 200th anniversary display of the material on the Mutiny on the Bounty. So a lot of it's there, donated by them. The ones that are most prominent are the Pitcairners. There are descendants of Fletcher Christian still alive today. as well as other mutineers who also live on Pitcairn Island. So the mutineers' descendants are still alive and well on Pitcairn and other places too. Pitcairn is small. It's like, like 5 miles across in both directions. If you want a future, that's not necessarily the place you'd want to stay. You can still visit Pitcairn if you want. It's not easy to get to. You have to do it from Moorea, I believe, and it's a 2-day trip on a ship. Yeah, you have to stay there 3 days and then take the trip 2 days back when the ship shows up again. So it would have been a fun thing to do, but my wife wouldn't let me do it.
Okay. How could the mutineers embarked on so momentous an enterprise without real grievances and questions of morality?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
If there's a mystery of the mutiny on the Bounty, that's it. What you had was people who were unhappy with Bligh, and Fletcher Christian, who thought that he had been put upon so badly. And to the extent that anybody has tried to psychoanalyze, I'm not sure morality enters into this thing. And it's, morality, one person's morality is not another person's morality. So I don't want to necessarily go there. But Fletcher Christian might have been suffering from some form of manic depression or bipolar disorder. He was in a horrible way the morning he woke up. He had a half-hour sleep. He had been browbeaten the last several days. And Bligh was basically, on the surface of it, a horrible person vis-a-vis his interactions with the crew. Did it justify a mutiny? Probably not. Did it? Several of the men tried to dissuade Christian from going ahead with it, but at the point in time that Christian was not listening to reason at all, at anybody, for that period of time where they, say, from 4 in the morning or 4:30 in the morning until early in the morning when they put Bligh in the boat, Christian was probably, and you don't get this in the movies, of course, because they're trying to show either Clark Gable or Marlon Brando or Mel Gibson trying to be at least marginally reasonable instead of, out of his ever-loving mind in doing what he's doing. And what the word morality does, or where if you want to paint yourself into a morality corner, which I tried to point out, is the mutiny cost the lives of 120 different people, probably more. That's just the count that I put in. More than half the crew of the Bounty ended up dead. Although Edward Young died of asthma. You don't know that for certain because John Adams told stories, and you don't know how many of them are accurate. But if you assume that Edward Young died of natural causes, then 22 of the 43 members of the Bounty crew died unnatural deaths.
Did Bligh go on to navigate for Captain Cook after the Bounty?
Captain Cook did not sail after the Bounty. Captain Cook died before the Bounty sailed. He was killed in Hawaii on part of his third voyage. One of the interesting things about that is in Tahiti and in some of the other islands that they stopped at, they all knew Captain Cook, and they would lie to the natives because Captain Cook was sort of like godlike to them. So they would lie and say, "Oh, that Captain Cook is elsewhere." They did not report that Captain Cook had died. Although I think in the Brando movie, one of the movies reports that Captain Cook died, and that was certainly wrong.
Did Bligh submit the sailors to keel hauling?
No, that's another one of the fictions in the movie. Keel hauling had been outlawed by then, and I think in both the Brando movie and in the Lawton movie, they do show an instance of keel hauling. And in one of them, I think the Brando movie, showing one of the guys eaten by a shark. Those are things that never happened. Keel hauling did not take place at that point in time.
The mutiny occurred at a time when revolutionary fervor was sweeping across Europe. Is there any evidence that the mutineers were affected by that?
Nothing, I think nothing overt necessarily. When they left in 1787, so they're not aware of the French Revolution. They know the American Revolution has taken place and that they got their butts whipped. But I don't think anybody looked at the American Revolution as anything remotely resembling the French Revolution. And so I don't think anyone would have been impacted by ideas growing out of France, because they left and they wouldn't have heard anything. I mean, they're in South Africa in 1788 in Cape Town. So that's even before and news of the French Revolution would have reached them there. So none of them would have been aware of that. Would they have objected? Or would they have experienced, for example, that opening statement that took place at the beginning of the Lawton movie, that brought about a new discipline? Probably more and more of them liked being whipped and whipped less and less. There's a very famous mutiny that took place a number of years afterwards, and that's sort of what kicked off. Of course, that's post-French Revolution, and that's what sort of kicked off the change in how the British Navy and the Admiralty dealt with the sailors.
Okay, and our last question this evening: how would you address the rumors that Christian Fletcher was alive in England and none other than William Wordsworth, a childhood friend, assisted him?
Okay, all right. There is indeed a story or stories that Fletcher Christian came back to England. I would tend to call it conspiracy theory stories, because there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Christian was in England. I'll give you a little bit of background on that. Wordsworth was maybe a friend of Fletcher Christian's. He was more a friend of Fletcher Christian's brother, Edward. Fletcher was 6 years older than Wordsworth. They went to the same school at some point in time, so they probably knew each other. And Wordsworth wasn't necessarily intermingling with Fletcher, but would have probably known him and certainly known him through the family. So when Fletcher is tried in absentia for mutiny, he's represented by his brother, who was a lawyer, and Wordsworth aided in the defense of Fletcher Christian. I'm going to try and pull this stuff together for everybody to the extent that I can. Sometime a little bit later, there were rumors of Fletcher Christian in the say 1805, 1806, 1807, that Fletcher Christian had come back to England and was seen here. He visited his aunt, although, again, what I want to reiterate is, no matter what I'm telling you, there's not the slightest shred of evidence to support any of these contentions, none whatsoever. No letters, no reports, no writings, no journals, no diaries, no nothing. What did happen at one point in time, and this is based on multiple hearsay, Peter Heywood allegedly was walking down a street in Portsmouth, and from behind, and he saw somebody from behind who walked like Fletcher Christian. He started to walk after him. The man turned around momentarily. Heywood took off after him and thought he saw Christian, and turned around, and he sort of started to chase the man. And he reported that, well, maybe indeed he had seen Fletcher Christian, although he doubted it. So that's the only, quote, sighting, unquote, of Fletcher Christian, which of course is at best almost non-existent, and at worst spurious. And like I said, it's based on multiple hearsay, because the time that story comes out, Heywood's dead. What you get, and then there's one other thing. Coleridge and Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Wordsworth are buddies. And Wordsworth is involved with Coleridge in developing the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And the discussions that they had absolutely had nothing to do with Fletcher Christian, but some people have seen the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is the story of Fletcher Christian, although you have to go into metaphor of the highest level of metaphoric thinking in order to make the guy who kills the albatross on the ship that's near the South Pole similar to Fletcher Christian, who's having a good time with all the girls in Tahiti. Okay, if you want to do that, you can certainly do that. But again, there is nothing, any way, shape, or form to indicate from Coleridge's notes, from Wordsworth's notes, from any other discussion, that in any way, shape, or form, Coleridge thought that he was addressing the Fletcher Christian story. But it's really important to point out that at this point in time, from this, the 1790s to say 1810, this period where Fletcher Christian is supposed to appear, no one knows what's happened to Fletcher Christian. Nobody, because it's not until 1808 that Mayhew Folger, an American, lands on Pitcairn. It's not until 1815 or 1816 that a British boat lands on Pitcairn and finds out the stories. What you get on Pitcairn is at least four eyewitnesses who testify, who write, who identify that Fletcher Christian was killed. Okay? So you have his wife, you have his son, you have Jenny, who's another Native woman who gave a report to the newspapers in Australia after she left Pitcairn, and John Adams. Now, John Adams may or may not have been a liar. He made up a lot of stories. His stories varied. But you've got four people all testifying, and everybody on Pitcairn today believes that Fletcher was killed. How could Fletcher Christian, if they burn the Bounty, how does Fletcher Christian get back to England? Does he paddle a canoe? No one else goes with him. So, I mean, the story, again, you can go onto YouTube and you can find a couple of videos where you'll find people propagating this theory and coming up with, quote, evidence, unquote. But keep in mind that all the evidence that they come up with is conjecture without any hard evidence to support it. So a long answer to a short question, there is no possibility whatsoever that Wordsworth helped Fletcher Christian escape from Pitcairn Island.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark, and nice to have you tie in that literary piece as we wrap things up this evening. And thank you all for joining us this evening. For those of you who have registered for this event, you'll receive a link to the recorded video of the presentation on YouTube. If you enjoyed tonight's program and look forward to more, we invite you to make a donation to the Walnut Creek Library Foundation on our website or from the link in the chat box. Your gift will make a difference. And a special thank you to our contributing sponsor for this evening, Bill King, who will be matching the donations made this evening. We hope you'll join us next month on December 7th for the first in-person Live from the Library program since early 2020. Charged Particles and Todd Dickow will be performing the music of Michael Brecker in the Oakview Room. More information and the registration link can be found on our website at www.wclibrary.org. Thank you again for attending this evening, and good night.